So I've been at Wolf. So Wolf's a top 100 CPA firm based out of Boston. About 400 professionals. I think we're in the 70s on the top 100 list. Classic audit, tax, and risk management. Our HITRUST group falls under our advisory practice. We have about 100 folks in our IT audit and cyber advisory practice. Been a HITRUST assessor, I think, for 8 years. I brought HITRUST to Wolf & Company. About 8 years ago, I was on the HITRUST Assessor Council for a 3-year stint, so very close working relationship with HITRUST. I am currently the Chief Growth Officer, so general responsibilities for all top-line revenue growth, but for the first 10 years at Wolf, I ran our healthcare IT audit and cyber practice. And I'm still involved with our big health system clients, Wolf & Company, and this predates HITRUST. And the reason why I think Wolf has a little bit of a niche working with providers with HITRUST, because it's definitely a different vibe to the assessment when you're in a big health system versus, you know, a health tech SaaS company that has a nice little neat cloud environment. You know, we have about 100 health systems throughout the country. I'd say about 10-15% of which we're working with HITRUST. With Mike and Chapters Health, we actually brought them through certification. But I'll go through the different variables if you are a health system or if you're dealing with health systems around how to scope the engagement. But that's just a little background of myself and Wolf & Company, and Mike will.
Hi, my name is Mike Parkin. I'm the Director of Security and CISO for Chapters Health System. I've been with them for about 11 years now. I've been leading the security department for about 6. The Chapters Health System is a post-acute care health system in Florida, Georgia, Maryland, Virginia, and DC now. We're going through a period of acquisition and growth. When we started our journey on HITRUST, we had around 1,500 employees. We have a little more than doubled that in the last 2 years. Most people won't have heard of us. We are primarily in the hospice industry, and we are the largest nonprofit hospice in the country.
Very good. So mainly as we kind of go throughout the presentation, we're going to really kind of want to focus in on kind of if you're a provider that is not going to be required through contract, you know, and that's 90% of who Wolf deals with are health tech companies that get that contract from Anthem or from United or Aetna saying, hey, you know, we want to see in the next 24 months, you know, you going down that path towards certification. And the real interesting part and why we thought it'd be a good presentation is really to talk about that original scoping when you're a provider versus a health tech company. What are some of the unique challenges that a provider will face versus a tech company going through the certification, and then kind of some lessons learned and some kind of gotchas and where we see the major gaps, you know, throughout the project. Obviously, we know that contractual requirements, and there is a subset if you're a provider where you may be forced to actually go through certification. So mainly we deal with a lot of ACOs, accountable care organizations, that have relationships with Anthem, Blue Cross, or one of the big payers. And those payers may be sending claims data to that provider and actually ask for certification and say, hey, we want you to commit you know, to a 12, 18-month, 24-month process. The other scenario, so that's really the only thing I've ever seen when a health system actually gets forced to HITRUST, but the Office of Civil Rights in general is never going to mandate that a provider pick HITRUST over something else as a means of HIPAA certification. You know, I have health systems that obviously use the NIST CSF, mapping the HIPAA security rule to it. We do CIS, critical security control implementations at healthcare providers. The scenario that I know you went under is, and for the most part, what I see when a hospital chooses to go down that HITRUST journey is someone on the board usually runs into HITRUST, they're concerned, maybe that hospital system, like Mike mentioned, is on a merger and acquisition kind of sprint, and they want that kind of HITRUST seal as you know, for marketing. And certainly, you know, the other scenario, so someone at the board says, hey, Mike, let's get HITRUST certified.
And that's exactly what happened with us, is it came from our CEO and our board. We started having conversations around it, and ultimately they decided to make it a strategic priority for the organization. And it came down to 2 points for us. One is it allowed us to have a roadmap for maturing our security organization, which was relatively new at the time. And then 2, it was exactly what Mike referenced. It was a badge of honor for us. It was a marketing opportunity. As we reached out to other nonprofit hospice organizations to try and get them to affiliate with us, we could say, look, you know, we have this certification. We put this effort into making sure our most sensitive data is protected. And that really helped to drive it from the top down in our organization.
You know, the other scenario, Mike alluded to it a little bit, is just improving your security posture. Dealing with a lot of hospitals that have been doing the same HIPAA security rule, NIST CSF review. So in general, in a NIST CSF review, if you're using that to map illustrative controls to the HIPAA security rule, because we all know, anyone who's looked at the HIPAA security rule, it's mind-numbingly vague, gives no guidance on what illustrative controls to actually show compliance to HIPAA, says things like reasonable controls, where you could have literally think tank discussions on what reasonable means. So, you know, that's going to be between 80 and 90 controls if you're mapping to the NIST CSF. Obviously, going to HITRUST, now, you know, if you go for the R2, and we'll go through the different assessments that actually weren't available to you at the time, so we had to do the full R2 assessment with about 400 controls, I believe. So obviously going from 90 controls to 400 is a sizable jump. But, you know, after 10 years of doing kind of the NIST, mapping, you know, a lot of health systems are looking to what's next. How can I incrementally, one, still be compliant with the HIPAA security rule and improve my security posture year over year? So, you know, with the health systems that we deal with, Mike at Chapters wants to get certified. We deal with other health systems that says, well, listen, certification isn't going to be in the cards for us, but let's do a full gap review against HIPAA so we can see where our posture is. And now, you know, kind of diligently creating a corrective action plan to, over a 3 to 5 year period, maybe come into compliance with HIPAA, but not getting certified. For some health systems, we'll actually cherry pick HITRUST controls and incorporate them into the NIST CSF review. So there's a lot. You don't, you know, there's always, I think, going to be a smaller subset of health systems or providers that get certified. Certainly a little different in the pharmacy health insurer space, where those organizations, although providers, kind of map to more of a corporate structure versus, you know, a provider with patients. But certainly PHI, one of the main considerations in any provider, is going to be extensive. There's going to be a lot of applications that house ePHI, and ultimately it comes down to really, what you want to get certified, and starting small. So you'll hear that theme come over and over again. And we talked about this. I would say the biggest challenge I've seen at providers, and certainly want your input, Mike. But so if I'm dealing with a health tech company, a SaaS organization, whether it be Meditech or Athena Health or any business associate that has a SaaS platform that they're selling into the provider space, 90% of them have either done a SOC 2 audit or have done an ISO 27001 review. They have experience with what an audit looks like. A HIPAA gap assessment isn't that, right? So when we go into doing a HIPAA NIST review at a hospital, yes, we're looking at evidence, but it's not that rigorous where we're actually pulling populations and doing samples. So when a health system comes into contact with HITRUST, it's that rhythm is very foreign to them. They don't see many request lists asking for 147 different pieces of evidence. So walking health systems through that and really doing that kind of crawl, walk, then run into how you present evidence and artifacts and how do you pull populations is kind of a hurdle that you kind of have to jump. I don't know if you saw that, Mike.
That's exactly what we saw. Annually, we would go through different assessments and review our security program and our posture at the organization, but none of that prepared us for the detail that we would find in the HITRUST control framework. We had to get a lot more granular. We were doing a lot of the things we needed to do right. We were not meeting the requirements from a lot of the documentation perspective. It was very much a lot of paperwork on our side and a lot of detail and evidence gathering that we frankly hadn't experienced before.
Yeah, for the full R2 audit, certainly that massive paper exercise. So, most health systems will have a set of HIPAA policy. They don't come close to what HITRUST requires. One from a policy standpoint, shall and will statements, but certainly on the procedural documentation side where, for HITRUST compliance, you need the who, what, why, how, and where that control is operating and, it's being monitored. And that kind of bleeds into the other hurdle that I see a lot of health systems jump, and that's proving operational effectiveness of a control. So, if you're doing a HIPAA review, if folks here know what a SOC audit is, if you're doing like a type 1 audit, you're basically looking at, do you have the control? Show me evidence that this control is in place. But to show that operating effectiveness over a period of time becomes much harder, and you need more monitoring and you need to have more oversight on that control. A simple example, I use this when I explain the difference between a type 1 and a type 2 SOC audit, is if we're doing a HIPAA review and we're like, do you do background checks? The HR director is gonna, here's one. Okay, you do background checks. But if you're looking for operational effectiveness of that control, we're now asking that health system to pull a population over the last 12 months. So the nature of the question changes. It's like, okay, send us all new hires over the past 12 months. And then Wolf, as the audit firm, is gonna randomly sample that population and now say, okay, for these 9 people, please send us their background check. So it now shows that control was operating over a period of time because some of those folks started in January, some started in June. So obviously it becomes more complex when you're talking about patch management and vulnerability management. But that's just a kind of a brief description of that. Again, it's shock and awe with a HITRUST request list. You know, and just doing that HIPAA assessment year over year, you get into that rhythm of what that entails. And now coming into an attestation audit where, you know, the bar gets raised on the evidence you have to provide is always shocking, I find, to a health system or a provider that hasn't been through an audit like that.
Yeah, we absolutely saw that. The paperwork exercises, we had to tear down and redo all of our policies and procedures that were touched by HITRUST. And then when we started dealing with some of our peers and other teams to ask for, you know, populations and evidence, particularly in HR, most of our HR team had come from a much larger health system than us, and they hadn't seen these types of requests before, and they were surprised by it. We did our best to try to prepare them for it, but this was all new for them.
I always see, and sometimes I'll see actual pushback of, like, you know, this being kind of the first audit that like network infrastructure folks go, but they kind of have this like, what are you doing? Why are you asking me this? Why am I sending you screenshots? And so there's a lot of that upfront work, and that's why HITRUST is an organizational decision. And actually, it was great. You know, I'm sure it was shocking to you when the board and the CIO came and said, hey, congrats, we want you to go for HITRUST certification. But at least coming from the board, there was buy-in from the top down of the effort.
And we absolutely, in some of the areas, we did get some pushback, but we were able to work through that because we had that push from the top, as our CEO repeatedly went in front of the organization and would talk about this being a strategic initiative for the organization. We had his backing. They knew what it was going to entail. So, you know, they didn't like it in some cases because of the extra work, but they all came around.
Yeah, and I'll be transparent. We talk to health systems, and they'll, you know, it'll be like the CISO and I talking. He's like, hey, I'm thinking of doing this, and you know, I want to be serious about it. I'm like, if you don't have board level support, do not do it. You'll drive us both crazy. You know, because once you talk about changing some foundational things, especially around policy, procedure, where, you know, a lot of policies and health systems are developed by the corporate counsel's office, and now you need to bring those folks in, and lawyers don't like changing words on paper very much. So it can, I've seen some HITRUST projects literally grind to a halt. We've done a gap assessment, and literally people look at the 60 some on gaps, and they're like, well, we need to buy MRI machines. You know, this plan isn't happening. There's still always value, but I always, you know, and I'll tell health systems, HITRUST isn't for you. You know, based on what I know, the effort that it's going to take, it has to be a serious. You know, you can't just go. You have to go all in with it. If you're going to have this laissez-faire attitude, it's going to come crashing down. It's going to end up being a waste of time and money. So things have changed recently, and the ability for a health system to start HITRUST has at least become more manageable. I-1 and E1, literally everyone had to go, as most folks here know, had to go for the full assessment, and that really stopped a lot of healthcare projects in its tracks. It's like, okay, let's fill out some risk factors. Okay, we want to get 17 applications certified across 40 hospitals and 250 physicians' practices. Oh, and by the way, with our risk factors, we have 787 controls. So, and all of them have sub-controls, and all of them need written procedural statements. So, you know, it just was like, stop. So, and I definitely want your perspective, Mike, but certainly with the I-1, which has, I believe, 182 controls, the E1 with 44 controls, now kind of gives a more manageable entry into HITRUST. And we're certainly going to talk about scope in depth. And the scope is still going to be critical no matter which assessment you choose. But definitely easier entry point. And I know you have kind of mixed feelings.
We completed our assessment a little over a year ago. We just finished our 1-year interim assessment in the R2. These other ones were not an option when we started our journey. I wish they had been. I would have loved to have walked into one of these. It would have saved my liver some abuse. But these are great, and I look at them, and they've spawned some conversations I've had with other peers and other organizations about, you may not want to dive in the deep end right off the bat, but E1s, you can bite that off pretty easily.
Yeah, I will say, it's not, with the I1, we have a lot of I1s and E1s in the field. I will say the scoring becomes a little more onerous when you only have a few controls in a domain. You have to be spot on those controls, where on an R2, the wiggle room within HITRUST is in the scoring. You have to score a 3 out of a 5-point scale on all the 19 domains, so you don't have to be perfect. You can NA some controls and not meet the intent of the standard a little easier, where if you choose an E1 or an I1, you really have to be spot on the controls. But certainly from a gap assessment, I think we have 3 I1s in the field at hospitals currently, and again, it's just a more manageable entry point. So scope. No matter who I'm talking about, it's like, okay, we're going to spend an inordinate amount of time, more than you probably even want to, talking about scope. Again, versus a health tech company that has this neat little platform within Azure, AWS, you really need to have, what is the health system trying to do? What are you trying to show? Obviously, in Mike's case, the board was looking for that kind of, that cert. Certainly you wanted to use it to improve your security posture. But early on, when we started doing HITRUST at some hospitals, we had some projects crumble in on ourselves. The walls just caved in because we tried to scope in too much. So 7 out of 10 times, it's really going to be your instance around your certified electronic health record system. So if you're on Epic, if you're on Meditech, Athena, McKesson, right down the line, at a maximum, you want to start out with that core EHR system. And now you're basically certifying your instance around your EHR. So access control and remote management and mobile device management. The scope in your instance was it changed over time, and we're going to talk about that, but we recommend, literally, we do scoping workshops with hospitals, and sometimes it's 60, 90 minutes, and we really want to set those boundaries. We want to know down to the router, switch, certainly the applications that are going to be under scope. We want to create those audit boundaries, because we don't want to scope in an Active Directory domain that has 37,000, users in it. That's not fun for anybody. So, we want to make sure we can create that, those barriers to scope out some problematic areas.
I agree with all of that. Scoping is so important, and as I've talked to other providers going on this journey or thinking about it, we spent a lot of time talking about this, and I've reiterated with them, spend extra time on this. It's critical to understand what your boundaries are going to be, and as we collaborated with Wolf on this, we had a lot of conversations around it, and for us, We should have focused more on starting small and spent extra time on that, but we wanted to go forward with a system that was integral to, very important to our process at the time, one of our primary EHRs. We got into a readiness assessment, and then we had to stop, and we realized that this is not going to pan out, so we had to go back and restart the process. Part of that was driven by a change in that organization. It was bought out. A lot of the people who had committed to making HITRUST happen with us in partnership just weren't there anymore. So we kind of had to stop and reboot.
Yeah, so it becomes problematic, and this is in all HITRUST engagements, if where you're housing the data, whether it's a co-location or a cloud provider, if they're not HITRUST certified, it becomes a challenge. And this particular vendor was not HITRUST certified. However, very open in the original conversations.
They wanted to do it.
To be part of the audit, because that's basically what you have to do. Because now, if it's a co-location, we have to come on site and do those physical security testing, versus where if it's in Azure, we can inherit their controls into the assessment, which is obviously much smoother. And that comes to a point I think we make in maybe the next slide. Don't be afraid, and I know it may impact budget, but it's actually going to save you money if you go through that scoping exercise. Don't get married to it, and don't hard code that scope. Allow the readiness assessment to play out, and for real red flags to show themselves, like it did when we started the readiness review.
Had we not stopped and restarted the project and we tried to ram it through after we encountered issues, we would have not passed an audit when it came time. It just wouldn't have happened.
Yeah. And I would say we probably changed scope, especially at healthcare providers. It's not a rare occurrence. So in the flip side, so I don't want to go overboard. So yes, we're trying to find a narrow scope. However, some conversations have led to the point where kind of we stop and say, well, this audit isn't really going to have any value. We've NA'd so much. We've kind of scoped out so much where, and that's where you kind of have that realization of, okay, let's just do the gap assessment, and let's take certification kind of off the table, because and I'm a regulator really is, well, actually a regulator, if the OCR comes in, they're going to look at the report, obviously. You don't want a report that has so many NAs and you've scoped out so much. There really isn't, it's not improving your security posture. You're literally doing a checkbox exercise where you're just trying to get that certification stamp. And because providers aren't, through contractual obligations, required, you have much more wiggle room in the scope. So it's really you're trying to thread that needle where trying to have a robust scope that's going to be small enough that's not going to overwhelm it. And going into another very important point on you can't do a checkbox readiness exercise. You're literally, if you're looking from a budget perspective, I recommend that sometimes the readiness review costs more than the validated audit, because that's where you're setting yourself up for success. In one area, Mike, that I know you spent time on and did a great job. It actually, I should have had it on one of the roadblocks, because this audit is organizational, really bringing everyone into the mix, from network architects to architectural folks to to everyone, to set them up to make sure they know they're going to be part of the process.
Yeah, you can't go into this project and think that this is just going to be a security project and me and my team are going to knock this out and we're going to get the certification and we're heroes. It doesn't work like that. This is collaboration. You're working with every other team in the organization at some level. We developed some really strong relationships, particularly with our HR team, compliance, even education was instrumental because of a lot of the onboarding and training that they're involved in. We had to work very closely with them because not only did we have policy and procedure changes, but then we were going to have to come back to them We need sampling data. We need evidence. You need to provide me this documentation. And that's going to be throughout the organization, so you want to develop those relationships and cultivate them because they're useful in the future even after this project is done.
What's a business impact analysis? You know, so what's a risk assessment? Not with you guys, but you know, I would say, and I tell, no matter if you're a provider or anyone going through HITRUST certification, when you pick an assessor, make sure, well, when you do a readiness assessment, make sure there's something there to score. Because, and that's why at Wolf, we kind of have I don't know if it's a different methodology, but we do workshops first before we even get into a readiness assessment, because we want to give homework assignments and say, listen, if you don't have any procedural statements, when we come in to do a readiness assessment, we're going to give you a gap that says you don't have procedural statements. Go write procedural statements. You know, there's very little value in that type of finding. The real value becomes, okay, we've tested your procedural statements, and these 17 are missing these sentences. And you know, you can see when you have something to score, you want that value in the readiness review. Otherwise, you know, and we stay close to our clients during the remediation phase, but something's going to get lost in translation if there's just these sweeping gap statements of like, you don't have event log management, you know, you're not tracking incidents, go do that, you know, and here's, you know, 4 different options, versus, you know, you know, you've already started, and now we can come in and actually look at what you're doing and be super pointed in our findings. That's going to give you the most value as you kind of set that corrective action plan. And for someone, you know, like a health system, that remediation phase is going to be much longer.
I think really in this phase, the readiness review is where we found value in our selection of an assessor. We had partnered with Wolf numerous times over the years and developed a great relationship and communication with them. And I think that's what helped make it successful, because to make this phase successful for your organization, there's got to be a lot of communication. You're going to be going back and forth regularly and working through issues, because there's going to be issues identified. And sometimes your team's going to look at it, what HITRUST is asking in a particular control, and go, I don't even understand what that means. Having an assessor you can go to that can give you a frame of reference and kind of explain what they've seen other clients, how they've handled it, is very helpful, and it is, you know, a lot of credit to how it helped us get through it the first time.
They're tough audits. I mean, they're just tough audits. They're tough audits for the assessor. They're tough audits for the client. And there's going to be, you know, and as someone who's managed a lot of SOC audits, there's a huge difference between a SOC audit and a HITRUST audit. The major one is that a SOC auditor, the AICPA does not QC every SOC audit that a CPA firm does. There is no such kind of thing like that. You know, HITRUST is ultimately giving the certification, so Wolf & Company, on behalf of chapters, had to go through this QC process. You know, a SOC auditor can make that determination in the field and say, hey, you might not be meeting the letter of the law of the you know, the confidentiality criteria on CC.5.7. However, as an auditor, I think you're meeting the intent of the standard. There's less wiggle room there, you know, and I think there's good reason for it, but, you know, HITRUST is much more rigid and prescriptive in how you have to have that control operating. So there's going to be times that you're just going to bang your head against the wall, and you know, myself as the assessor is like, that's just the way it needs to be. But for, you know, I think especially jumping to version 11, that's really improved, and we'll be going through that with you guys. But definitely a point to definitely be noted. So the number one issue by far is around business continuity planning. And this is, I'm not trying to be disparaging when I say this, but healthcare, health systems are really the last of the bunch to go 100% to the cloud. A lot of health systems still have data centers, sometimes right across the street from the hospital. So when you talk about, should be a 100-mile buffer, that box doesn't get checked. So, and especially, so one, the BCP plan hasn't been updated, isn't actionable. There's about a 1/4 inch of dust on it. The other thing, and especially with larger health system, the BCP plan is siloed oftentimes. It's like, one business unit will have their BCP plan, another business unit will have their BCP plan. So you have to get that, you have to rise that out of the rubble and try to create this organizational plan. The other thing is not having done a business impact analysis. So in a health system, that is so critical. Forget HITRUST. I tell people, if you had to choose between one project, forget HITRUST and do your BIA. If you had to choose two, because that's how critical it is. So literally going business unit by business unit, going to oncology, going to cardiology, really cataloging what those critical systems are and asking the question, how long can this be down? What are the recovery time objectives, recovery point objectives, RPOs and RTOs that are critical to you? Taking that information back to the network infrastructure team and said, hey, oncology says this app has to be up in 15 seconds. Is that even possible per the plan? And it's actually 15 days according to the plan. So reconciling that, and go, and I know, Mike, that you
I
lived
can
it.
easily speak to the first two examples. They were gaps that we identified. We needed a lot of work on our paperwork. It was a massive effort to catch up on that. And then we were one of those organizations, we did not have an updated business continuity plan, and I could find no record of any BIA ever been performed at that organization. So we partnered again with Wolf. We brought in somebody that we worked with every department and every team in the organization and ran through that exercise, and it was very eye-opening. Some conversations were had because we had those conversations about expectations that we really hadn't had. Everybody in the department and a lot of the leaders just assumed IT was going to take care of it. Yeah, we had great operational contingency plans and excellent backup and recovery procedures, but we didn't know what the expectations for a lot of the businesses were for some of their applications. And then there were some other areas where we own a small pharmacy that we use to service our patients in the Central Florida area. And when it was asked what would happen is if that building burned down tomorrow or it became inaccessible for some reason, and there's a lot of blank stares in the room, patient care leadership wasn't thrilled by that. So there were some really good conversations that came out of that project.
Yeah, I mean, as a firm, we do almost as much BCP work in healthcare organizations as we do HITRUST or HIPAA. There's always kind of that it's kind of a detective exercise sometimes, because I've been in meetings where it's like, I didn't know we had that application, and it's like, oh my goodness.
That absolutely occurred with us. There were some things we identified that, a lot of people that I know in our IT department have been there for 5, 7, 8, 10 years, never heard of some of these apps.
Yeah. So that BIA is really going to help turn that your BCP plan. And again, most hospitals, have a good IT DR plan. They know what they have and kind of, for redundancy and failover. But having done that kind of business unit by business unit crawl hasn't happened.
Yeah, and it's not just the IT part, like he said. It's also the facility for us is where we really struggled with a lot of it because it was never really talked about or looked at. It's a little bit different now, a little easier with so many people remote. A lot of the buildings are less critical, but you can't say that about all of them in our case, like the pharmacy. You know, that's got to be up and running, and there's got to be people there.
Yeah. I mean, there's a well-publicized health insurer breach up in the Northeast with, I don't want to get the name, Point 32 Care. It was Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare and Tufts Healthcare got hit, and Harvard Pilgrim, which is a medium-sized health insurer to the smaller side, they couldn't process a claim for 45 days. I mean, it impacted a lot of our hospital clients that were using them, you know, to process claims. So having that plan, obviously the optimal is you're taking 5-second snapshots. So if you get hit by ransomware, literally, you know, you're losing 5 seconds of data. But that business continuity plan side of it is really that BIA. You know, I'll briefly touch on, obviously we talked about the paper exercise. Risk assessments, most healthcare systems, you know, have a handle on it. I will say, you know, a risk assessment to an audit firm really is at a minimum, you're looking at inherent risk of those assets you're including. You then have, you know, that classic red, yellow, green, kind of the adequacy of your controls, and now you're coming out with a residual risk score. So, you know, some health systems fall short. They'll say, oh, you know, we downloaded this thing on the OCR website. And I'm like, okay, well, if the OCR comes in, I'm a little upset with the OCR for some of the guidance they actually give health systems. I'm like, if the OCR came in and saw you're only using their tool for your risk assessment, you're gonna get a big fine. You know, and again, you know, we're starting to see a shift. I will say I deal with so many hospitals that on average, a health system is gonna be spending between 2 and 3%, hopefully 2 to 3% of their overall IT spend on security. You know, you wanna see that north of 5%, but again, you know, and the OCR being very punitive has turned the needle. You know, a $5 million fine to a 3 to 8 hospital system can be super problematic. So you never want the fear of regulatory action to be the driver, but I'll take it. You know, it's moved the needle a little bit. But you're starting to see spending more on folks like Mike, you know, actually being competitive in the chief security officer space. And we see a lot of hospitals actually go into banks and poaching banking CISOs, because banks have literally been doing, you know, control testing for 25 years. But I'm getting a little off track. The SIM, so a security incident event management system, you know, I would say most hospitals, unless the very bigger ones, you're probably not going to own your own SIM where you have, triage teams and blue teams, you know, acting on that information. That's kind of a managed service provider. So having at least a MSSP, you know, looking at those threats and you're acting on those reports is really what we're looking to see. But a lot of health systems still don't have that functionality, so there's an extra spend.
So we stubbed our toes on scope. Part of that was not necessarily in our control, but it still occurred. We look at it as a lesson learned. Take more time on this. Make sure that if you're using a SaaS provider, make sure that they really understand the lines of responsibility that you're going to run into with this. We also ran into an issue with our initial data center provider. They weren't HITRUST certified. While we were on this journey, we did end up moving our data center to a new one that was HITRUST certified, which helped with a lot of the physical security control inheritance. Less work for me. I love that.
You know, we've actually touched on most of this. You know, I would say you're always going to stub your toes if you don't dedicate yourself to the pre-work.
I will definitely speak to this as pace yourself. This is a multi-year journey. Don't think like in our case, we went with the R2. We didn't think we were going to get that in 6 or 12 months. We knew this was going to take a couple years to work through, and it did. It was almost exactly 2 years for us.
And that's the value of not being forced into HITRUST for a provider. You can create that roadmap that makes sense versus, being a health tech company worried that Humana isn't going to sign your $10 million contract, unless you show those milestones consistently. There's always going to be that added pressure in that scenario.
Yeah, we touched on the internal communication. It was critical, and it's been a benefit for us in the long run as well. Understanding the schedule changes, we're going to have to deal with that with our audit coming next year. It's going to change. I'm interested to learn what the changes are. I don't.
Yeah, we're going to have to. So in this scenario where we're going from whatever 9.6 to 11, we're going to have to come in and do a targeted readiness assessment on the net new controls within version 11 to make sure chapters are going to be ready for the certification process. And I'd recommend anyone working with an assessor to scope in a targeted readiness review.
If making sure that you have senior leadership buy-in is important. We had to spend extra money. We needed extra tools and some additional consultant to get through it. So having them there to help support you and okay that money when you have to spend it is really helpful.
And again, these are the key takeaways that we've kind of hit. I'm just seeing if there's any. Don't be afraid to pivot is super important. Creating the runway. And understanding what you're trying to do and why you're even going down the HITRUST journey. It's the HITRUST. One isn't for everyone, but certainly in the provider niche, that's a bigger chunk of it's not for you. So make sure when you decide on going down it, you know what you're getting into, so you can set yourself up for success. So with that, we'll stop. And thank you for coming to the session. I know folks are itching to get a bite to eat and a drink, and so thank you.
Thank you all.